Hello there. Designing a user interface is hard, and it's really difficult to get it right. A good UI is the bridge of understanding between the player and the game, whereas a bad UI is more like a thick fog that confuses the player and leaves them unsure of what to do next. But if you're anything like me, when you hear the phrase game UI, you will probably think of menus, health bars, ammo counters, and minimaps. And while yes, these are all examples of UI, there are actually many more ways we can think about the use of UI in our games. It's definitely way more interesting than I used to give it credit for. There are 4 terms for user interfaces that you should learn that sound complicated at first, but are actually really easy to understand once you get to grips with them. So subscribe for more game dev content like this, and let's crack on with the first one. So those first examples I mentioned, such as health bars and ammo counters, usually fall into the same category of non-diegetic UI. These are the user interface elements that are rendered outside of the game world and are only visible and audible to the player, like all of these parts of the TF2 UI. This is usually the easiest and most direct way of communicating simple information to the player really quickly. This is why it's so often used for important stats like health and ammo. It does have its downsides though, and I'm currently grappling with this in my current game project, Project Drifter. I've been adding a bunch of these non-diegetic UI elements to my game recently, like health bars, a minimap, a drift meter, and a currency counter, and they're starting to clutter up the screen. This means the player can see less of the actual game world, which is a bit of a problem, but I'll talk about that a bit later on. Next, we have diegetic UI. These are the interface elements that are actually a part of the game world, meaning they can be seen and heard by the game's characters. The ammo counters on the guns in Dead Space are an ultra common example of this, as are the health indicators on the back of the player. Diegetic UI tends to be much more immersive than the non-diegetic counterpart. The information presented to you is literally a part of the game's world. There's no quest objectives or health bars in Journey, it's just you and the game. And I think diegetic interfaces are really cool, they just aren't always the most practical. Sometimes you just want the player to really quickly understand something without having to interpret it out of the game's world. Then we have spatial UI elements. These are shown to the player within the space of the game's world, and they can be diegetic or non-diegetic. The medic's Ubercharge beam in TF2 is a really good example of a diegetic spatial UI element. It spatially represents who is the healer and who is the healee, the person being healed. It does this by literally connecting them together with the beam. It is also diegetic because the beam is actually a part of the game world. All of the game's characters are seeing that beam as well. A non-diegetic spatial element would be something like the little arrow indicator above your player character in Fall Guys, or even your name tag above your character in Among Us. We as players can see the little arrow or the name tags moving around spatially within the game, but they don't actually exist to the game's characters. They are just for us to understand the game better. Then finally, we have meta representations. These can exist to the characters within the game world, they just aren't necessarily visualized spatially to the player. A really common example of this would be in an FPS when blood splatters on the screen to indicate that you've taken damage. Because in the game world, the character could have taken damage anywhere, but it's represented to the player as a metaphor by the blood splatters. The compass in Spelunky is another example of meta UI. The Spelunky character would have a compass item on them, showing them a direction to travel in, but instead of literally showing the player the tiny compass in the game spatially, we are instead given this giant red arrow as a meta representation of what the compass is telling the character. So what do we do with this terminology? How do we use it to make our own games better? Well, even just by being aware of it, we can start to think about our own UI elements differently and how they could possibly be represented in a better way. Or even how they could be combined with some existing elements we've added to really clarify some information to the player. For example, in my game, I've added a drifting mechanic to my cars that is really similar to the drifting mechanic in Mario Kart. Now, this has a really cool diegetic UI element in the form of the sparks that come off the car while it's drifting. These sparks represent the power level of your boost, with a blue spark being a smaller boost, and a gold spark being a much bigger boost. This worked really well until I added character selection at the beginning of a run. Each different character car has a different threshold for how much charge is needed to get the blue and then the gold boost. I really want the players to clearly understand why certain cars get their boosts really quickly and other cars take a while to build up their boost charges. So having a non-diegetic version of the sparks that just really clearly presents that information to the player seemed like a really logical choice. The bar will also make for much clearer visual changes when the player buys an upgrade that changes the way the drift works. If they buy an upgrade that means they'll get their drifts charged faster, then they'll see the drift bar shrink. In contrast to adding additional elements to the UI, sometimes it can be worth considering if you can remove certain things, because sometimes less is in fact more. For example, I don't display the health bar of every enemy to the player because that would be way too much non-diegetic spatial UI. It would just look way too cluttered. Instead, I just don't think that the players need to know that information. They will slowly work out through playing the game several times, roughly how much damage each enemy can take. They know that if they just keep shooting the enemies, they will die at some point, and I'm not going to break that rule by making any invincible enemies, so there shouldn't be a problem. As one final example from my current game and ideas, as I mentioned earlier, I want to try and reduce the amount of non-diegetic UI presented to the player. I know that I want the health bar, the drift bar, and the currency meter to all be there. I might play around with the sizing a little bit, but they are here to stay. However, I'm much less happy with the way I'm handling those mini-maps at the moment, and I really want to change the way I'm approaching this. And I'm not quite sure yet whether I want to try and work out some really interesting way of diegetically showing the player the level layouts, or whether I'm just going to put them on a toggle like most other roguelikes do. There are other features I want to deal with much sooner, but thinking about UI through this non-diegetic, diegetic, spatial meta way really helps get the gears turning on thinking about different approaches. And to further this, I think it's really important that we all just think about UI a bit more. We need to ask ourselves, are we showing our player enough information, or are we giving them too much unnecessary information? Could parts of your game be made clearer if you took a different UI approach, or could they be made more immersive? Could this information be presented to the player diegetically or non-diegetically? Whatever you do, hopefully this framework provides you with some new ideas on thinking about the UI in games, and that it's actually a bit more interesting than at least I initially gave it credit for. Subscribe for more game dev content. I'm here every week and I always try to cover something new and interesting in each new video. Follow me on Twitter for pretty sporadic updates on Project Drifter. Join the Discord if you want to talk to me and some others about game dev, and until next time, goodbye.
String of words that I think I've used before. Can't think of another creative way to twist it.